Good morning, everybody. I forgot the microphone. Normally, I have a lavalier microphone. Morning. Welcome to the Rencontre économique d'Aix-en-Provence with a small audience, I must say. But remember, you should be wearing the mask, I was told. But that's what I was told. Anyway, we're going to have a debate, except us, to face the challenges of the most severely impacted sectors. Needless to say that the crisis hits some sectors much more severely than others. We'll talk about this. It's not necessarily behind us, notably for those who suffered the most. And we saw in the previous session, one of the key questions that arises is how we unplug the people from the subsidies and assistance they got to face this unique situation, closing down the world for several months, and this unpredictability in which we continue to live with this Delta new variant, and we're going to have to continue to live with this virus. And we know that which sectors were the most impacted: tourism, event specialists, social relations, and those who couldn't respect the distancing. Here we are together in a room. So Alexandra Roulet from the Cercle des Economies will introduce our debate, and I'll introduce the other panelists who are around me. We have Dominique Carla, who is the Vice President of MEDEF, which is we have Philippe Guillemot, Director General of LER Group, restaurant business, canteens. We'll see how the crisis hurt you. And left to my right, we have Didier Klein, who is the head of the Chamber of Commerce of Paris. Paris, of course, is also impacted. First touristic region of France. So it was severely struck or hit by the crisis with the lack of congresses and so on and so forth. And at a distance, we are happy to welcome the former governor of the Estonian Central Bank, who is an economic advisor of Ardo Ansal. Good morning. And in China, we have the head of a scale group, Marjorie Young. Good morning, madam. Hello. Ni hao. And we'll start with you, Alexandra Roulet, so you talk about our debate. So for a few words of introduction, we have a session on the challenges of the sectors that were the most severely impacted. But we have to remind that the state really played its role in 2020 until today, in the last 15 months, to amortize the shock for businesses in the sectors that are impacted. You must remember that in 2020 compared to 2019, there was 30% of bankruptcies, less bankruptcies in 2020, less bankruptcies than a normal year, thanks to the Solidarity Fund, partial unemployment benefits. And what's interesting for our session here is that the sector of activity was didn't predict the risk of bankruptcy. So those who suffered from the restrictions of the pandemic did not go bankrupt, thanks to the support of the state. But what should we expect in the 15 months to come? And the question arises of the disengagement of the state, as Philip said. So there's a consensus with the economists that we shouldn't go too fast, like we said, like we did in 2008, 2009, austerity and everything. But at the same time, we are forced to to answer this question of debt and disengagement of the state. And there's also the obvious important questions of the private aid, because while businesses did not go bankrupt, well, it's by generating debt. Massive debt, and so the re-engineering of the debt is an issue that will have to be faced. And so this is one of the first topic in terms of public policies, and then there are other consequences, more of the socially speaking. Obviously, on the social standpoint, we know that the pandemic had very negative effects. A lot of people were struck by poverty, notably the youth. But there are some positive consequences, unexpected. It's the pressure to rise salaries in sectors like restaurant businesses. In the States, for example, in the United States, for decades, we had low wages that stagnated. It was a real issue. You had the big wages that skyrocketed, and today what we see in the sectors impacted by the pandemic, typically the restaurant activities, there was no partial unemployment benefits. What they did is they terminated their workers, and now that they want to hire them again, it's difficult to find people. And so this will lead to higher wages to attract employees. And so the question of wages is really important, how you can recuperate the labor force that was laid off for a large part of the year without activity. And the last quick point on the environmental aspects, when you think of the impacted sectors, it's quite heterogeneous. Personally, it seems that for most sectors like leisure activity, restaurant business, in my opinion, things will go back to normal. People won't change their consumer habits. They want to go to the cinema, to the restaurants, shows. But for air transport and business trips, of business traveling, I think there will be a longer-term change because we became aware that we could work efficiently without traveling so much. And since this interacts with these environmental issues that we have to reduce traveling, well, there are some major challenges to face. We can see the positive aspects. We saw that we could be more efficient than we thought by traveling less, and so reducing CO2 emissions. But for those sectors concerned, it's a big challenge. So I'll hand over the floor to the panelists. Thank you, Alexandra, for this presentation. We'll start with Dominique Carlac. Maybe a macro global opinion. The idea is not to go back on the past. We know which sectors suffered, but what are the challenges that you see? They're of several nature. Not everybody has been vaccinated. The crisis is still there. And there are some sectors that are still impacted by the stop of the public support and public aid. What does the MEDEF have to say on that? Well, first of all, the MEDEF says thank you to the government, to the state, because the strategy of whatever it costs, Macron's strategy was this pandemic was the equivalent of a world global disaster. So there had to be we had to save the world massively. And so it's important to underline or to highlight that rarely as the civil society and economic and political sphere has been in a consensus to recognize the need for this massive support. And it was quite basic as a choice, because we had the choice between increasing the public deficit and debt with negative interest rates, and maybe a wall of bankruptcies and terminations. And the choice was made, and it was a good choice. So while the strategy of whatever it costs is needed, the strategy of unplugging is also needed. Why? Because first of all, an economy made up of entrepreneurs who are in a profusion of support, aids, and subsidies. That's not the DNA of the entrepreneur. You know, you don't live off subsidies, and you stop. It's the energy of creating value, and the rhythm of the increase of the debt cannot be continued. It's imperative to stop, and so the economy must recover as rapidly as possible with a strategy of unplugging the system from government aid. There are sectors, which are more severely impacted. You've mentioned them. We'll talk about tourism. We'll talk about event organizers. As long as the borders are not completely open for a country like ours, it'd be difficult to unplug the aid given to the tourism activity. or for economic model, the business model. Event organizers, you can't set up an event like this one without planning ahead. And so the economy must recover. And then to think of this recovery and what we could imagine as a recovery plan, because in the end, with the aids that were given, we can consider that there were three strategies. The strategy to support, which is the equivalent of strategy to compensate faced with a brutal stop of the economy, which doesn't come from the economy. So this is finished, except for some sectors. We can imagine a strategy for the recovery, but if it's not based on the recovery of consumption, it's not well suited, because we had a lot of savings made by the society. And when you look at the consumer figures, well, it works by itself. We have plus 30%, plus 50%, plus 70% in some trade activities. So there's no need for a recovery strategy. But what we need, and what the MEDEF is calling for, is truly a strategy and a support plan for the transformation of our economy, a transformation which could appear like the Biden plan, for example, for infrastructure, training, digitalization. But the recovery plan, is it the same as last year? No, that's why we want to make proposals, because there are two sectors that were not been concerned by the recovery plans. It's the industry of services and this industry of the presence economy, because traditionally the industrial recovery plans are for industry, but we saw clearly that with the issues of sovereignty, if we can only produce or relocalize in industry in France, it's part of the way, but we don't gain sovereignty that way. What's lacking is a recovery plan that really integrates all the businesses, all this, the sector of design, engineering, advice, consulting, everything that concerns processes and products. Otherwise, we'll become, factories of the world or factories of Europe. But if we don't have recovery plans for the whole service industry and for this event organizing industry, we'll lose our independence and our capacity to be able to design and so produce and consume in our own country. And so the recovery plan, we want something that is more focused on services, whether industrial, but for industry, but also for services. So thank you for Dominique. So we see that the MEDEF has proposals to make. We want to co-develop, co-build. So you have your summer universities at the end of August, but you're still expecting a second plan, of recovery plan. Philippe Guillemot, you've heard what Dominique Carlac was saying. You run the Elior Group. You were strongly impacted by the telework, I imagine. So you can tell us how you survived to the crisis. Maybe we can talk about the future also. And you heard what Dominique Carlac said. Shouldn't we really put everything you can on services? Isn't that the key to pull out of this crisis? Well, absolutely. I will answer from the perspective of a company that employs 110,000 people in the world, 45,000 in the field of collective restoration and cleaning activities. And so the public rediscovered the importance of my activity. You were on the second front. You are on the second front, yes. Please don't use this expression. It's it's an offense to our. It's the President of the Republic that used this expression. No, I tell you, it's an offense. There's no second front. There's only a first front. So we're strongly impacted. To give you an idea, we lost 70% of our turnover during the first confinement. And if we survive, it's thanks to aids from the state, extremely efficient aids and subsidies, and the partial activity that enable us to maintain our collaborators in activity who can today come back to work since the activity has recovered. And it's not the case in the United States. Big difference with the United States. And the second is the exemplary commitment of our teams that managed to find solutions faced with all the challenges they had. So in the recent months, I acquired three convictions. First, the recovery must go through a massive support for the development of new services in France. Secondly, there will not be a successful recovery without a real solidarity shock. And the third is that, in fact, we will not have a sustainable recovery without a deep questioning of the system. So on services, why services? Because it's 80% of the added value today. 3 jobs out of 4. 9 female employments out of 10. It's the shortest track between consumption and localized employment. Often it is not possible to delocalize this employment. And these jobs today are often those who give access to the labor market to people who wouldn't have access to the labor market. And with qualifying jobs, which are social elevators. Support, yes, okay, fine. With the measures that we had during these successive confinements. But today, I think you have to facilitate the development of new services. In my trade, for example, we invent new offers to adapt to telework, to respond to the demand of flexibility from collaborators who can work from home, for example. Unfortunately, the tax laws, well, say that you can't subsidize the meal of the employee only if it's consumed on the place of work. At home, it doesn't work. So maybe we should review this. And solidarity shock. Now, macroeconomically speaking, if you don't give access to vaccination to poorer countries, we're not going to pull out of this pandemic. The other question we can ask ourselves is that at the dawn of a 4th wave that will mean sanitary restrictions again, we can wonder if we shouldn't make vaccination compulsory. And we see the destruction of jobs these sanitary restrictions lead to. And the last point, in terms of solidarity, we should seriously be concerned with those who were the most severely impacted, youth, for example, people who are at the entrance of the labor market. Here we have to be very creative to facilitate access to the labor market. And I think that we were also all deeply shocked by the lineups of students waiting. They went to food banks, to get food. While there should be other solutions, it's normal that at 6th industrial power that we should be fighting to provide food and rely on associations, on non-profit organizations to provide food to the needy. And the third point is we'll have to really review everything, all the challenges we had before the pandemic, climate warming. We're talking about 5% of the increase of CO2 emissions by 2025. Anyways, the pollution with plastics, the increase of obesity in the world. So it's still there. So the businesses we're part of will have to be judged on their financial criteria, but also the extra financial criteria. Their contribution to take up the challenges, in our case, is fighting against waste, food waste, a reduction of plastics, single-use plastics, and new offers that use less animal proteins. So the services, of course, solidarity, a real solidarity shock, and a speeding up of all the sectors, whether they have benefited or been impacted by the crisis. Thank you very much, sir. Didier Kling, President of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry of Paris and Île-de-France, so you on your side in this major capital region. How did you live through the crisis? We see that there are impacts that are still there. Do you hope for a recovery? There's a serious, like business tourism, congresses and everything is still hurting. Well, we certainly have hope. We wouldn't be in business. It's a lot of enterprises pay a subscription at the Chamber of Commerce. So the Chamber of Commerce is an observer with these 800,000 businesses, and we're also actors through training, teaching, and event organization. So the sector was strongly impacted. As an observer, what I see is that we tend to say when there's a crisis, the world after will not be like the world before. But truly, no. The world after will be subject to stronger evolutions because of the crisis. We talk about the aeronautic sector. What strikes you is that there are problems linked to the crisis and changes in behaviors, but will business tourism develop at the same level? They are big contributors to the air traffic. You have meetings of the boards, once every 3 months in the world. Will this happen again tomorrow? Instead of having 4 meetings somewhere on the planet, you will have 2 or 3 in video conference, and then you will travel once. That will change our relationships. It changes the scene for airline companies, but also benefits to the ecological transition. So the answer is technology, innovation. That's what will help us to change. And another sector that we observe closely, and that is the sector of trade. Trade, it existed before e-commerce, e-trade. It existed before the crisis, but was marginal. Of course, it underwent a strong development where it represented 15%. It's now 25% of online trade. And so I don't think the consumer will change behavior. The trade must adapt to this new situation, this new context. Second aspect, as an actor of event organizations, is simple. In March of a year ago, more than a year ago, we shut down the agricultural event. 500,000 people were expected. It's zero, but it's recovering. Will the Rencontre économique d'Aix, this year we thought of doing this in video conference, but people thought, maybe it's better to be in Aix. It's a hybrid solution, a little bit of video conference and a little bit in presence. But it's a pleasure to have a coffee together, and virtual restaurants don't work that well, so we're happy to meet each other again. We tested Vivatech at the Porte de Versailles in Paris, and it was a hybrid type of event. There was a gauge, maximum 5,000 people, but there were a lot of people who joined in. It's interesting that an event like Vivatech on high technology and in Vegas, for example, a big technology event, 85% of the participants said, frankly, being here is much better. But there's a wish to meet again. People may be a little bit afraid, but there are more and more people that are vaccinated. So in the problems, in the bottlenecks of this recovery, isn't there a very important concern that is to have the workers, salaried workers who come back? I'm thinking of the restaurant business, hotel activity. They're not in activities that were well valued. They talk about the second front, but isn't there a way of adding value to these professions, to these activities, notably through wages? 2 answers to the question. That is a broader question, that is. Back on the events, the business model of these events, it was transformed after the crisis because the physically present, but when I go visit an event, I pay. If I'm on my screen, well, the business model is not the same, and I don't have profitability, and I don't cover my expenses. So there's Maison Urgée, another event that will take place in September, as an example. So what about those salaried workers who got used to teleworking? It existed before, but it was marginal. And today, it developed. In such conditions, it's difficult to hire a collaborator if you don't offer partly teleworking periods. It has consequences for the employees, but increases productivity, in fact. So it has advantages. Disadvantages, as an employer, I can say that if you're 20 kilometers away and I don't see you often at the office, fine. But rather than being 20 kilometers away, why not 1,000 kilometers? And if you were 10,000 kilometers away, maybe the cost would be different. And so teleworking is fine for some activities. There are studies that show that in Ile-de-France, some 40–45% of the work can be done remotely. But yes, okay, but if there are support services, well, fine. But everything related to technological innovation, creativity, obviously you have to be together. You have to share. But some collaborators said that teleworking is really nice. I don't feel like coming back. And notably in the sector of restaurant activity, there are 100,000 jobs that are not filled. And some restaurant owners say that it's difficult to hire people, to find people. It's a difficult job. It's with long hours. You work during the holidays and weekends, and people want to do different other things today. So you have to strengthen the attractiveness of these activities. So now we will move in with Zoom. Thanks to the magic of Zoom, our two guests. Ardo Hansen, who is the economic advisor of the president of Estonia. Good morning, Mr. Hansen. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning, bonjour.
Bonjour, c'est à vous. Vous avez 6 minutes pour nous parler.
The floor is yours, sir. 6 minutes. Oui. Yes, you can start. You can start. Go.
Yes, you can speak now.
Can you hear me? Okay.
First of all, a pleasure to participate in this conference because I know how important it is in France, and even doing this virtually is a great honor. And I think it's optimistic or positive that even in some hybrid form, we're finally coming back to normality and having these types of semi-physical interactions. Yesterday, I saw the first cruise ship came back to Estonia, to Tallinn, and I think if you had asked in March of last year, put all the sectors of the economy and thought which will be the most permanently impacted, I probably would have thought of cruise. Even the fact that is restoring, I think, gives some optimism that the future might be a bit brighter. I think the crisis has been incredibly dynamic and unpredictable, and though we get smarter all the time, if you see what's happening now in Australia or in the United Kingdom or Russia, where suddenly out of the blue some new wave hits, it shows that you have to be quite nimble. And I think the challenge has always been for enterprises and the governments who are trying to support them. One is liquidity and one is solvency. And they are interrelated too, and I think the governments, everybody, the public sector was always much better placed to support liquidity. You can do it through forbearance. If the tax authority just is more understanding of your situation, allows you to defer the payments. The banks are understanding. If your suppliers are understanding. Governments also like to give liquidity support because on paper at least it's reimbursable and therefore doesn't create permanent debt for the government. So there was a lot of it on offer, and I think in our country a large part of it was never actually taken up in the end. That the private sector and also the central banks and financial supervisory authorities also allowed the banks to provide forbearance. And I think if we look back, one of the great success stories will be how able the banks were actually to provide this support. And we haven't yet seen any major problems for the banking sector. The banks were much more solvent than they were 12 years ago, much more liquid, and therefore they could handle much of the nitty-gritty details. So history has not been written yet, but I think that was a very positive picture. Now, if the situation persists, then of course what started out as a liquidity problem could become a solvency problem. And here I think it's a lot trickier, has been a lot trickier for governments to support sectors, because what you really need is equity. And if you're already on the edge and the government says, I'll give you more debt, that might not be part of the problem or the solution. Now, maybe there are some big sectors here, where aviation was mentioned, which is probably a bit of a different case in the sense that if a sector is deemed strategic, if it's a big company, then governments can somehow deal with it. And if they fear that there will be too much disruption, they will find a solution. And since the state aid rules have been suspended, it's possible. I think it's much trickier on the SME end. It's really hard to conceive that a government would take an equity stake in a restaurant or a hotel, and somehow I don't know if it's possible to do this through banks. So I think the only feasible solution here is what has been done, is you basically just give subsidies, and that's a type of equity support without creating ownership claims. And in preparing for this meeting, I really started thinking more about whether we shouldn't look at the whole crisis more through an insurance focus rather than through a banking or, let's say, investment focus, that it was just a bad event, some accident happened, and we're in the kind of normal business of an insurance company to sort out which is a legitimate claim, and insurance company doesn't want an ownership stake in your car. They will just pay the bill. Of course, you have to phase these things out over time, and I think we have to now move from more general macro support to even more targeted approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we could come back to you to discuss about the level of bankruptcy we could face during the end of the crisis. But before, we're going to listen now. Marjorie Young, SKL Group. Marjorie, are you here?
I am.
Yes, you are here. So,
first of all, I'd like to say that there is nothing that is going to stop me from coming to France. So as soon as travel becomes more normal, I am coming. Now, going back to the topic of today, I'd like to take a slightly different stance. So about 3 years ago, we have been facing disruptive forces such as digitization or digitalization, technology in general. AI has been posing a threat to the current forms of business. And I was an optimist who said, we shall adopt these technologies and make our company more competitive. An old professor said to me, not so easy. Sure enough, inertia. The crisis, COVID-19, has in fact become the impetus that has pushed us to transform and adopt means to combat these disruptive forces and turn them into innovation. Allow me to share some our experience. So our company, we make shirts for brands like Hugo Boss, Lacoste, etc. Anyway, our business dropped to top line has gotten to about half its previous level. But we have been able to become much more efficient through digitization, because all of a sudden customers are more willing to adopt technology. So digital sampling versus physical sampling. We've been promoting these concepts for a long time, but it has been difficult to adopt because it's different. Secondly, digitalization. Digitalization means new business models. So we have gone from being an OEM to much more manufacturer direct to consumer. And that has also allowed us to understand the consumer better, also to enhance our OEM business. Robotics and AI has always been a threat. However, there is an opportunity here because we have been enhancing our ability for automation, where automation is not replacing the job of a worker, but enhancing the work of a worker. And because of the crisis, people are much more willing to adopt these new technologies. Secondly, work of future. Again, this crisis has helped to propel a leapfrog move to adopt wellness as a competitive advantage. We all understand that this is not going to be the last pandemic. So while we have been promoting better canteen, better diet, all this is now much more appreciated by our workers. Our whole workforce has accepted that this is a road to more competitiveness rather than just a burden. Finally, I believe the most important transformation is the measurement of success for business. Sustainability and our people's well-being as most important metrics for business success. But the two go hand in hand rather than obstacles for business competitiveness. So we have in fact invested in an ecotourism garden in the beautiful town of Guilin in China. And we find that there are a lot of opportunities for interaction physically and to discuss, just like today, with an international group of friends to find new ways of competitiveness and sustainability after COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marjorie, for your presentation. Je reviens au français. Je voudrais...
I would like to now carry on with our discussion, which was clearly laid out, talking about the risk that was mentioned earlier by Ro Hansen, talking about zombie enterprises. Isn't there a risk that by wanting to keep the oxygen supply going, we might have a system where not where the government is going to be a shareholder in restaurants, as our Estonian colleague said, but isn't there a risk that might have a delay in the necessary adaptations? And as Marjorie Yang was saying, the adaptation can be quite difficult. It requires automation and needs more productivity. Perhaps at the MEDEF, in the two brains of the MEDEF, we have the bank brain and the rest of the world. At the MEDEF, the French Employers Federation. How do you reconcile this? Isn't there a risk that at a particular time we're going to have the banks in the front line, having to help the enterprises that are in the most difficulty? The type of aids are very varied. The support plan compensates, and the recovery plan accelerates change, so that indeed. So we'll have to accept bankruptcies. Yes, we'll have to accept transformations and have to help people through those transformations. When you look at the figures, you can't have a crisis without bankruptcy. This has never been seen before. There haven't been many bankruptcies in this crisis because of this state aid. To avoid these bankruptcies, we have support to compensate for the lack of business activity. However, there may be zombies hiding in these groups of companies with these new types of consumption that the crisis, the pandemic has revealed. We will have to help companies through this transformation. It's a transverse transformation, which will include services. What does that mean exactly? It means that we are going to help the transformers themselves. If we don't help the transformers, we won't have a transformation or acceleration, and then there will be bankruptcies of companies who haven't converted. And the second thing we mustn't forget is that we talk about support for this transformation, but here we are in a pandemic. This is a virus which affects people's health. What will be the next pandemic? It might be digital. It could be a cybersecurity crisis. Yes. So that's why it's so important to help companies through this transformation, so they have a transformation of an economy, so including the people carrying out this transformation, to reduce the risk of a future pandemic or crisis. Didier Kling, you wanted to react? No, Dominique. Yes, I think in the last 2 months, we shouldn't be too afraid of having helped these companies, being afraid of creating zombie companies. We have to look at the degree of support that each company is receiving. We had two types of risk. Either we didn't support them enough and we had companies that were productive and were becoming bankrupt nevertheless, or we gave them too much support, then you do have a risk of having non-productive companies that are being kept alive artificially. The first risk is more serious. It would be more of a problem to have companies that were totally productive that had to close down because of the pandemic, because there would be have a longer-term consequences. So if you're achieving these two risks, it's better to provide massive support. I don't think you should be afraid of potentially providing assistance to companies which were more in trouble and which would have perhaps gone bankrupt in any case. So the first point. The second point is we're looking ahead to what's going to happen now. There's going to be another situation. We've had less bankruptcies in 2020. So this means these companies who've managed to survive is often because they've accumulated a lot of debt. If they, so it's unlikely that after the crisis they're going to become viable, even though they've been able to continue for 2 years. So in fact, you're going to have to expect an increase in the number of bankruptcies. This is not a failure of the support policy. It's just that we've enabled companies to survive during the pandemic, and after that there will be the traditional Jupiterian process, which has to run its course. Didier Kling. Yes, if I jumped like that, it was because, of course, yes, there will be companies who are going to die, but a company creates itself and lives and then dies. There are many bankruptcies and closures happening every year. That's perfectly normal. What strikes me fundamentally is that in this crisis, we have realized how important the role of the state and of the local authorities is. And previously, the government had really withdrawn somewhat from its economic role and carry out its traditional role. And they said, OK, I wasn't very good at managing businesses and economic activity. But during this crisis, and with the tremendous support that has been provided, which is going to continue, the recovery plan is 100 billion, which is a lot of money. At the same time, the government, the state is once more having a more strategic role. This is the battery Airbus. It's the relocation of certain activities which are considered quite rightly as being strategic. We have to define what is strategic and what is not strategically important. And so the government, the state is playing a more strategic role in economic life. The important thing that this doesn't mean that we have a government that is administrating the economic world. It has to avoid making companies less efficient. That's a real revolution. Didier. You're the Chamber of Commerce, you manage a number of schools, and you work in education. It will be one of the subjects be to help people cross the road, as we were saying earlier. In other words, you're going to perhaps some professions are going to disappear, as we said earlier. Maybe certain jobs people won't want to do. Maybe we'll have automated restaurants in the future. Maybe there'll be new professions. We talked about the Airbus of batteries. Not necessarily in the big conurbations. For some of them, these are new. There are some plants being built, for example, in Xavier Bertrand's region. Are we going to see a major transformation of economic activity and the places where we work and the way we live and the professions that we have? Students are changing a great deal in what they want to do. 20 years ago, they still want to save the world, yes. 20 years ago, their ambition was to become the boss of a big company, perhaps in one of the in the stock exchange companies. Now they say, I want to have an office with a more comfortable carpet and bigger windows. That's no longer the case now. Like they say now, so they want to create their own company. Even if maybe a few years later they can sell it at a good price. They want to create their own company. In what sort of area? They want to work in health, in mobility. So there's been a complete change of the attitude of our students. Philippe Guillemot, what do you have to say about this, these aspects? We're talking about the world of services, which is important, and is still there. There's a minister for industry, but no minister for services. Just, I'd like to say one thing: our employees just want to work. That's all they want to do. They don't want to stay at home and be paid to do nothing. Earlier, I was talking about how we manage food vulnerability in France. It's completely the wrong system. Before the crisis, we had about 10 million meals were distributed by associations. That's 30% of those associations, Restaurant du Cœur, 60% of food banks, and 10% other associations. That's very good. It's very good, except that they were completely overcome by what happened, because we moved from 10 million meals to 3 million meals because of the crisis. And what was distributed just increases the difference between those who can have a healthy meal and those who cannot, because the people distributing the meals These are products that can be conserved for a can of food, pasta, rice, etc. These can be kept for a long time. Whereas elsewhere, for example, in the US, we continued during the first lockdown to deliver meals to schools. And these meals were distributed to children, even though they didn't have any classes. We produced 70 million meals for children, for the populations who are at risk of poverty. Today we have the tools. We are capable of producing meals at extremely low prices. They're very healthy meals. We know how to distribute them to the local authorities. So we have a solution to hand which creates jobs as well. For 80% of the people I feed, I create one job. One job for somebody who was about to get a job. I can train them, and this job cannot be relocated. So the important thing is, where do we earmark public money? We don't want people to have to ask for charity. We want people to be able to give work to our employees, and we want to be able to solve societal problems. I was talking about the solidarity shock earlier. Yes, it's true also for the elderly living at home, the meals at home. Here again, with the aging of the population, it's possible to create a whole range of services for this population group, which will create jobs again, and which will give work to people who would not have a job without these service jobs. I've been in the industry all my career. It's no miracle. If you want to reindustrialize, you have to create 4.0 factories. There are two people, one to turn the lights on and one to turn the lights off. Demi Kala, do you have a Keynesian brain and a Jupiterian brain? Jupiterian brain, yes. Should aid be continued in these sectors? A bit of Keynesian attitude. First of all, people who are in poverty, the most in danger. That's one they need. That's assistance. But for the rest of it, we have to support the offering. So I'm repeating. We have to have a transformation plan based on three things: digitalization. We've talked about greening, and also, as Philippe Guillaume has just mentioned now, we have to focus on training, because there are professions that are declining, others that are less attractive, and other professions that are emerging and developing. And here we're seeing an acceleration in this decline and in this emergence and in this development. So in the second recovery plan, we're talking about, is this skills above all? It's skills, yes, and reconversion of these skills for people already on the job market, but who no longer want to carry on doing the job they were doing before. And there's access for young people to new professions and to satisfy new needs, because we have new modes of consumption and new visions of enterprises. I'd just like to add that for young people arriving on the market today, they want to have something that's meaningful. That's what they're looking for. They want meaning. Alexandra. Yes, from a conceptual point of view, training in new jobs is absolutely vital, but the problem is putting into practice. It's true, we've mentioned young people. They certainly are going to choose training courses, and education is more looking to the future. But the problem is all of the people who are older, for whom reconversion is more difficult than an initial training. For people who have less qualifications, who are going to work for 20 years in a particular sector, the idea of being retrained to do something else is more difficult. We can see this clearly at the job centres in France. When we offer them training, there's not much appetite, in fact, for people to change. Well, the young people have this enthusiasm for the sectors of the future. I think if you look at employees who are 50 years old, it's much less obvious for them. It's much more difficult. It's very well putting money in training and education, but you have to make sure the people who need this education and training do benefit from it. And there are very concrete details for implementation of these programs, which are difficult to solve. Conceptually, it's obviously the solution, but it's difficult to put into practical implementation.
If you are here, Mr. Hanson. Yes, I have a question for you, listening what you said before. I don't know if you understood what we were discussing. We were discussing about education, formation, and the need for more subsidies, but not only to save companies, but to change the workforce and to help them to go to the new jobs.
No, I think there are two. I mean, behind this this. I mean, there's the direct impact of the pandemic, and then what would have happened in the world without it. And I think somehow these other processes, whether you call it greening or digitalization, are probably more fundamental and hard, in most cases, probably not directly related to this crisis where you talk about restaurant workers or something very specific. And here, I think I'm less concerned about the zombification issues simply because of the nature of the shock. I mean, this wasn't the shock that came out of some fundamental weakness in the economy, and that people have been kind of investing in the wrong sectors and businesses have kind of made the wrong decisions. This came right out of the blue, and I think a lot of these sectors are in difficulty through no fault of their own. You can't say to the restaurant owner that you should have known that in 2020 there would be this pandemic and you should have prepared for it and not invested in and so on. So I think that lessens the uniqueness of this event, lessens this worry that it will permanently impact, I don't know, tax discipline or repayment of loans or so on. There will always be some fraud, there will always be some misallocation. Somebody who was going to go out of business anyway was given support they probably didn't deserve, but overall, I think this issue, there's not so much to worry about if there are sunset clauses to all of these programs. What I'm maybe more worried about is that we can swing back in the other direction very quickly, and I think a lot of these issues you see now and problems in supply chains maybe come from the fact that the recovery was more V-shaped and more rapid than we expected, and we're now caught off guard. And I think governments can be caught off guard not only by negative scenarios, but by a very positive scenario where suddenly recovery is much more quick. You put a lot of fiscal support on the table, and you have to somehow shift from a paradigm of looking for support to actually trying to move back to normal.
And maybe also a question for Marjorie Young, if you're here also. Marjorie, I don't know if you understand all what we discussed before. We were discussing about jobs, and listening to you, I was wondering, more digitalization, does it mean less jobs, less good jobs for the young people?
I don't think so, but I think it's up to the business leaders to make sure that we are trying to have inclusive growth. For example, to start our workers who are relatively older, to stop being afraid of technology is a good start. So we have been adopting a way of learning to code, developed originally at MIT, called App Inventor, so that the older worker can learn to write an app. So the mother would tell the son, I am not out of fashion. I can move to the technology era. It is important to preserve their sense of confidence and then move them to the digital world. For young people, I think is to encourage them to innovate. I recently saw a young man who is inventing, he is putting together a table that helps workers at home for the aged to move the patients. That will make the job of caretakers at these homes for the elderly much more interesting and thereby attractive. There are a lot of jobs, but there are a lot of jobs and there are a lot of people who are unemployed. There's a mismatch of jobs and people. So how do we make those jobs match the people who need to work? Especially, I think worldwide there is a group of young people who are looking for jobs that are more exciting or less dirty. And there's a lot of opportunity in that. So I'll stop my answer there.
Thank you very much. Pour revenir en français.
To come back to French and with our speakers, this is to draw some conclusions now. Maybe I could ask a question everybody is asking themselves. We've talked about the risk of a fourth wave. Minister Véran said this. He said it might already have started. Concerning all of the sectors we've mentioned today, tourism, events industry, aviation, transport, etc., isn't there a risk that you might have a lot of pressure and tension between people who are vaccinated and who aren't vaccinated? Do you think it may be necessary to have a obligatory vaccination? Are we going to move into a phase that we've seen in other more authoritarian countries where we have to have zero COVID in the street? Because we'll no longer have the budgetary means or economic means to deal with this fourth, fifth or sixth wave. Didier Kling. In the events sector, we already have the answer. The answer is very clear, because you can participate in a trade fair, in a conference, but only provided you keep to a number of health rules. But the free tests are going to be finished soon. That's why I'm saying about vaccination. That's a problem of society. As far as we're concerned, you can only enter an event if you've been tested. There are thermal cameras. There are systems that are organized and in place. Our main concern is to protect the health of our employees and the visitors and the professionals working on the stands. For us, this is an absolutely essential point. Is this going to create tensions in society, do you think? It could create tensions, but this is an area that is outside of my remit. We're certainly going to change our habits and behaviors, I think. A while ago, a year ago, when you were in a meeting, if somebody arrived around a table with about a dozen of you around the table, some people, and who had the flu, for example, if he was coughing a little bit, if he sits down next to you, you're not very happy. You're uneasy, and you think I might need to take some pills this evening when I get home. Today, if the same situation, if you put a mask on, you might stay at home. They have the same problem in the cinema or in an airplane. I think this will change people's behavior, certainly. Dominique Carlac? The tensions already exist. I won't talk about the population in general, but in businesses, we're already seeing changes, because those who are vaccinated and those who don't want to have the jab, paradoxically, those who don't want to have the jab are the most demanding and want to have the more health protocols and more health gestures. I hope, as part of the social dialogue, we'll be able to get people to understand that if you want to live normally, as far as possible, you have to have the jab. And we hope the government will be putting this message across. Philippe has something to say as well. I think the choice will be two intentions, either tension about vaccination or the damage it's going to cause for employment. We're going to have to choose between the two. When you see that in Lisbon, the first measure they take is to put everybody back to working from home. Imagine in my sort of job, what's going to happen? You have to choose, and it's urgent to choose. The famous protocols, ever since the 1st of July, we have so-called new protocols in the companies enabling everybody to come back to work, but that's not true. 1 meter between each person means in the lifts, and you have to have only have 4 people in a lift instead of 20. You can't so that means you can't get everybody back to work. They won't be able to get to work. So the tension is already there. It already exists. Alexandra, we've talked about a lot of different subjects. You have the difficult task of drawing some conclusions now. Yes, I think we have a consensus about the fact that up to now, the pandemic has been well managed, but we have many challenges in the future concerning, first of all, this fourth wave, and also what I've heard a great deal is that the challenges are challenges that existed before COVID. Digitalization, the ecological transition, etc. COVID has just revealed these crises and accelerated the progress in a very positive way. And the last big challenge, I think, is the next crisis. Apart from the fourth wave, which will be just an additional stage in this pandemic, we have to hope that with most of the population vaccinated, even if we do have a fourth wave, the hospitals won't be so saturated with patients and we won't have so many health restrictions. So we can hope we'll get out of this pandemic. The question is, will we be ready for the next crisis? because we've done a tremendous amount of work and made a huge effort to get out of this one. If the next crisis, whether it's a health crisis or another type of crisis, the next macro crisis, it arrives in the next 5 years. We have to hope that the government and the state, etc., has it back on their feet, and the economic world too. As France has about 30 points of GDP of debt every crisis, so we'll be down up to 60 points of GDP if we have another crisis. We have no time left, and so we'll head back to the organisers. Thank you.